Hey everybody, Andrew the Corn-Fed Viking back with another video. Today we're going to be looking at how to make a custom shaving brush with rose gold colored Alumilite. Let's go ahead and get started here with the process. First thing we're going to do is drill out the hole for the knot. Now this was a custom one that was done for a muley knot. I think was a 25 millimeter one, and I found those run a little bit small, so I drilled this one out to 1 inch. Looking for the depth to be right around 20 millimeters on this one, but I always do this in a couple of slow steps just to make sure we're not over drilling it. Obviously you can't add more material back in there once you've done it, so take it slow. Run my RPMs, I don't know, somewhere in the 400 to 500 RPM on my variable speed lathe. This is a Laguna 1216. It's been a great lathe for me. It's my second one. I used to have an old Jet 1014, I think it was, but this Laguna has been a nice upgrade for me. I really like this lathe. Do another spot measurement here, right around 20 millimeters, which is a little shy. I think I actually wanted to take it a little bit deeper than 20 millimeters to make sure that that knot had enough grab sort of above the glue spot on it to make sure it's got enough depth on it. So another quick measurement here, and should be off and running. So here we'll switch over to actually doing the top shaping. I've always been a fan, especially with Alumilite, of just doing the kind of the scrape method with a skew chisel. So you can see I'm just kind of eating away at the bottom part here where kind of the transition between the top and the bottom sits. So I just find this to be the easiest and safest way to shape when I turn the skew on its side and start doing it as you would kind of in wood. I find it's very catch prone, especially working with the plastic material, so I try and be careful about that. So here I'm trying to shape the kind of transition point between the top and the bottom. Find giving this a nice little angle profile chamfer makes it look nice instead of going straight out. That little junction right there to me is the hardest part of turning a brush, getting that as smooth as possible so you don't have to do much sanding work. It's impossible to get into that section good like you can on the rest of the brush profile with the sanding pads and whatnot. So to me it's pretty critical that this part is as smooth as possible coming off the lathe, so you don't have to try and get in there and do a bunch of sanding work later. And it drives me crazy. I guess it's my kind of perfectionist nature to see a little ridge or unsanded or unpolished area on those parts of my brushes, so I really try and get that as good as possible. And sometimes it drives me crazy trying to get it there, but try and do my best, and I try and keep a little bit of a point on the end of my skew chisel to try and accomplish that. So you can see how I'm spending, you know, a kind of extra amount of time on that to try and get that to where I have it, and I think I've got it good there to where I think sanding can take care of the rest. But as smooth as possible on that part always makes the sanding and polishing steps go better. So I'm just rounding off the top here a little bit. Actually going to put a little bit of a chamfer on that also. Just gives it a nice appearance. And since this is a smaller knot than I usually drill for my brushes of this size, I think that chamfer adds a nice visual touch on the top there. Then I always just round over the inside of the knot hole just to make that transition so it's not so sharp on the knot. I don't want to provide a breakage point. So I'm going to get ready to reverse chuck this and start on the bottom. I use these Beal collet chucks. I find these are great, especially if you're using imperial measurements. If you're trying to drill with millimeters, these don't work quite as good. And there I've noticed a little bit of a dig, kind of a groove on the face there, so I'm going back in to try and smooth that out a little bit before I flip it around. As much as you try and keep things symmetrical, once you flip the brush around, it's never quite the same as far as how true it is. So try and get all the shaping that I'm going to do on the top part done before I switch it around. You can see there's just a tiny little wobble in the top there. These collet chucks provide about the best experience for that if you use just an expanding jaw chuck, that works fine also, but I find that that generally has even a little bit less true nature once you flip it around. So these collet chucks, when I can use them, provide the best option. And they also allow me to do the sanding and some of the polishing on the actual lathe versus having to use a screw chuck or something like I typically do on my other knot sizes. So here I'm just putting a little indentation in the end to allow the live center to go in there to give me some more support. And then we'll come in here with one of the negative rake easy wood tools, or easy tools, I can't remember exactly what they're called. I'll put a link in the description for those tools. I love these things, especially on the resin materials. Those negative rake make your life a lot easier. That's not so critical on Alumilite because that stuff turns a lot better than, you know, polyester resin or even epoxy. Epoxy is pretty easy to turn too, but especially on polyester, if you've got you know, the inlace acrylester or anything like that, those polyester resins are very brittle, and so these negative rake inserts on the end of these easy wood tools make life a lot easier. You don't get as much breaking and chipping like you would otherwise. So here we are doing the bottom half, just getting my measurement laid out there. I was trying to recreate another brush. You can see this one here that I had done in that same general shape. The customer who reached out had this muley knot that wouldn't have fit in the one that was on the store, so this is why we customized this one to fit. This customer is located overseas, so get the measurements and everything all worked out between the two of us to make sure it's gonna fit that knot. So here I like to turn away the bottom waste material as much as possible so you can actually work on the profile. If there's too much of that sticking out, it makes it hard to shape down there, especially because I like to use the skew chisel scraping method. So here I'm turning this down fairly small so I can start working on that profile. I saw someone reference using the toothbrush somewhere online, and that actually has worked really well. I know you probably shouldn't put your fingers on there while the lathe is turning. That's definitely a dangerous thing to do, although I don't listen to my own knowledge and safety heedings on that. But the toothbrush does work pretty well to get that stuff out of there. So good tip for anyone who needs it. Turning away a little bit more of this, you can see how that started to get in the way of the skew chisel there, so taking down that even further to allow myself a little more. Actually, I guess it was the negative rake scraper, not the skew chisel, but regardless, that little part on the end that connects to the live center always gets in the way, so I generally have to take it down in a couple of steps to make sure I've got room to work down there. And as far as this transition part goes between the top and the bottom, I always leave a little bit of material there so I don't kind of oversell myself too early on in the shaping process. So here you can see I'm starting to kind of work my way up to the finished profile that I want on there. If you cut that away too early, you sort of commit yourself to exactly how it looks. So I like to get more of the profile, the general shape done before I eat away at too much of that, just so I'm not so committed on exactly what the shape is going to be. So here I'm taking a few measurements. One of the things I always like to make sure of is that the bottom part is a little bit shy of the top part. So here I'm doing a profile check with the existing brush. You can see how that bottom part kind of bulges out on the very bottom a little bit more than this one does, so we'll get that taken care of in due time. But making just a few refinements here, but I don't like Personally, I don't like it when the bottom, the part that you grab, sticks out or bulges out further than the top part does. I think that just doesn't look very appealing to my eye, so I always like to have it to where the bottom's a little bit smaller in diameter than the top. So here I'm going to turn away part off the piece that was connected to the live center there, pull that away, then be able to do a little bit more direct shaping of the bottom part before I get ready to drill that out for the coin. One thing to say too about the bottoms is it's more difficult from a turning standpoint to get a bottom to be perfectly smooth than it is to put a coin in there. So that's my theory as to why people started using coins, so they wouldn't have to perfectly get all that material out. Now, I had drilled this once and forgot to record it, but the sizing wasn't quite right for the coin. I've got some different coins that I've been working with lately, different colors of metal, these brass ones that the customer wanted for this one, and they just didn't fit with the normal bit that I use. So I got out one of my metric bits, and we'll kind of go through the process. Obviously it's too small there, so got to go in with this three-sided tool. It's a Sorby, I forget exactly what it's called, but this thing works really good to just edge out that diameter a little bit and make it big enough so that it's suitable to accept that entire coin. So this is a process of trial and error, stop and go, and of course the coin gets stuck in here like it does every time, and it's not a magnetic one, so I can't use my magnet to pull it out like I do on some of the other ones. So these coins I get blank, and then I use a metal stamp to stamp in either the Viking helmet or one of the other options. I think I've got Odin's Raven and Celtic woven cross, and one other one that I can't think of off the top of my head, but they're all on the website as far as which ones customers like to get. So this is kind of the traditional one though that I've had for several years. And yes, I know Viking helmets probably didn't have horns, but that's okay. This is just part of the brand, so we're not going to worry too much about exact specifics of Viking paraphernalia. I like how it looks, and the customers seem to as well, so we're sticking with it. Now I'll kind of adjust this shape inward a little bit so that the lip is not so overexposed, so that the coin is a little bit more flush with the lip. So here I'll just round this off a little bit and take off that harsh edge on the bottom where the coin goes, and just a little bit of additional shaping here, and should be good to go. Wasn't obviously satisfied with how the bottom part looked as far as that profile goes, so just making a few minor adjustments. You got to be careful with those collet chucks, because if you do get just a little aggressive or hit an edge or something, it will totally knock that thing out of center and basically ruin the progress that you've made. So when you do, I should have put the live center in, I think I do here in a second, to make sure I don't make any mistakes that would cause me to have to potentially go back to the starting point here. So okay, by far the most boring and tedious part of brush making is the sanding. So this part probably won't have much commentary through, but I'll just make a few comments here as it plays along. I really like these padded sandpapers from Mirka. I'll again put a link for those down in the description, but a lot of people like to use the meshed, which I think is from the same manufacturer, and that stuff works great also, but I've just found that I like the results from these ones better. I think they leave a smoother finish on Alumilite. Alumilite is a little more tricky to get a good polish on. compared to something like polyester resin. I've just found that it turns really well and is great from that standpoint, but from the polishing aspect, you can't get quite the shine on it that you can with polyester resin. And polyester resin is super easy to shine. It's very forgiving from a sanding standpoint. I think that's because it's a more brittle resin. I think that surface hardness is just enough to where it allows for better polishing. And I've communicated with the folks at Alumilite. They've given me ideas and polishing tips and whatnot, but I've ended up coming up with my own set of steps here, and I really like these little sandpapers. They come in sheets that are maybe, like the size of an index card or so. They also come on big rolls, depends on the size you get, or the grit rather. But I take these and cut them into these little pieces, and I'd say they last for a couple of brushes each one. So I generally start with 320 and then work up to 400 and 600. Those are all with these same padded sandpapers. And then I move on to wet dry, the 3M automotive wet dry sandpaper for 800 and 1000. And then I go, I also, before I go too far, as you can see on the screen, these little rubber pad backing or sandpaper backers for details. So that area that I talked about earlier from a turning standpoint is tough to get exactly right. It's also tough to get exactly right from a sanding standpoint, excuse me. But using that little backer pad to give some rigidity to the sandpaper does help with that. So after every grit, I also go in and sand it along kind of north-south, if you will, on the profile to try and remove any of the circular sanding scratches that are in there. This is just a step that I've always done, from back in my pen making days and working on CA finishes and whatnot. This is a step that I've always done, and since Alumilite does tend to be a little more finicky from a sanding standpoint, it's important to make sure you do this. At least I think it is, when you're looking for the best possible outcome. And I love nothing more than a nice shiny shaving brush handle. So I really put a lot of work into the sanding and polishing aspect, and it takes probably twice as long to do this part, the sanding and polishing, than it does compared to the turning. The turning really is the easy part of brush making. The casting and the turning is easy, but the sanding and polishing is the more tedious and difficult part that you always kind of dread having to do. But when you get good results, it makes it all worth it. And a happy customer obviously makes it all worth it as well. I also use a spray bottle to keep the wetness for the wet sanding. Obviously keeps the heat down, and again, I think just provides a better overall smooth surface. So here I am moving on to 400, I believe is what this one is. And again, I just go through the same process, and to extend what I was saying earlier, I use the wet dry papers from 3M for 800 and 1000 mesh, and that's where I stop with sandpaper. Then I move on to Mother's mag and aluminum polish. I do that on the lathe, and then I move on to my buffing setup, which I'll talk more about once that part of the video arrives. One thing I forgot to mention earlier about the spray bottle is, obviously I think it keeps things a little bit cleaner in terms of not having a container of water dripping all over below. But I've used that method before too, and it does work okay. But inside the water bottle, I put a tiny little bit of dish soap in there with it. I read this tip years ago on an online, I think a pen turning forum or something, but you put a little bit of dish soap in there, it helps with the lubrication, and seems to keep the water in a usable state for longer than if you just had water from the tap put in there. So I don't know if that does anything actually, but certainly has worked for me. I've had water in there for over a year probably, and it seems perfectly fine. Doesn't smell musty or anything when it's coming out with a little bit of soap in there. So, but I think generally the real reason for that is to help with some of the lubrication on the sanding. So works out great. I don't know the science behind it exactly, but it's a tip I read years ago and it's worked out real well for me. I've found that folding the paper like that helps to get it into those crevices when you're not using that rigid backing piece of rubber like I showed earlier. So folding it definitely is helpful, and then using your finger to kind of provide the profile on the curved parts there also seems to work well. And I know I could have cut out a lot of this sanding information, not information, but sanding video clips, but I think it's important to show, for those people that are wanting to get into brush making, how long and kind of involved this part of the process is. It really is a critical part of the operation, so I think it's important to show. Obviously you can fast forward through it if you don't want to see it, but I think it's important to show that part. So here I've switched over to the 800 grit. You can see this is that real thin automotive wet dry sandpaper. The stuff's really nice for kind of the last couple of steps, and after 400 I don't sand with the profile. I only do that for 300 and 320 and 400. Once I get to 600, I find that you kind of hit a point of diminishing returns with that process. So takes that a couple of steps out at least of having to do that with all the grits. I don't find that it makes a difference if you sand with the profile on 600 or higher. So here's the Mother's Mag and aluminum polish. I started using this stuff a long time ago. I read it somewhere online, but it just gives a nice kind of initial polish to the surface. And I've really moved to using mostly automotive compounds from a polishing standpoint. I do still use my dry on certain brushes if I feel like it needs a little extra kick before I get too far into the fineness scale, but I always start with the mothers. It again just gives it a nice polish before I actually head over to the buffing wheel. I do apply it and then turn my lathe speed up to generally over 1,000 RPM. You can see the shine is already starting to come out a little bit as I kind of continue to work that compound in, and it continues to get picked up by the blue shop towel. So here I'm moving over to the buffing setup. This is the compound that I use the most. It's the Meguiar's Professional Pro Speed compound. It's the extra heavy cut. I've been through every type of buffing material and compound imaginable. I've got containers full of the stuff in my shop, and I've come to this stuff and gone away from it and come back to it. And at the end of the day, I mean, I've tried specialty plastic solid compounds, which I have and do still use from time to time, but at the end of the day, this Meguiar stuff really provides the best finish I've found. So that's something I've used for many years, and again, I've got bottles and bottles of the stuff, the different cut levels and all that kind of stuff, and this extra heavy cut really just does the job better than any other ones do. And I don't generally find that I need to go much finer than this. I've tried the 3M buffing compound. That's what Alumilite recommended to me years ago. You can see the shine's already starting to come out on just a couple of minutes of buffing. But this stuff makes quick work, I would say. I mean, again, the sanding really is the tedious part. The buffing is not near as bad. It does take some time to get it right. But if you start with a good surface, the buffing process is relatively simple. The thing is, if you come at it with swirls and marks on there, the buffing compound is not going to be the thing that's going to get those out for you. Those really need to be taken care of in the sanding and the turning part of it. Each step, the smoother the surface is that you go to the next step with, the better off you're going to be. So don't sit here and pound your head against the buffing wheel trying to get swirls and scratch marks out, because it's just not going to happen. And I found if you get too aggressive with the buffing wheel, especially on that transition between the top and the bottom sections of the brush handle, you can end up kind of melting the plastic a little bit, and it just makes the surface real rough. Then you got to put it back on the lathe and redo that part, and it's just a pain in the butt here. So anyway, long story short is the Meguiar's compounds are great if you want to get more than one of them to do multiple steps. Obviously that's up to you, but I've again found that if you come to the buffing wheel with a decent surface, a decently smooth surface, you can usually get away with just doing that heavy cut, the Pro Speed compound, and should be off and running. It also depends on the color of the Alumilite. And again, if you're doing polyester, I'd probably be done buffing it by this time already, just because of how quick that stuff buffs out. But certain colors like dark solid colors tend to need a little more care at the buffing wheel, just because they'll show any minor imperfections more so than something like this color would. So just something to be aware of. But this is a Fordham. It's actually a jewelry buffer. I've have gone down the buffing road in several different formats over the years. I've got one that I can mount into my lathe. I've never used a full large wheel buffer because I find those run a little bit too fast, and I like having the variable speed control over this one. I also like these smaller 4-inch buffing wheels. I feel like they kind of marry together better with the size of the shaving brushes. And as you can see here, I'm working on this transition part because, again, that is the most difficult part to turn, sand, and buff of any shaving brush. So I spend a disproportionately large amount of time on that transition compared to the rest of the handle. So that wheel is charged with a lot of material I generally just take a small, maybe a nickel or quarter-size blob of the material and kind of work it into the wheel before I start. Otherwise it just splatters all over the place. I generally start pretty slow, and then I'll turn the speed up as the wheel dries out. I found that if you get too aggressive while it's wet, that can really kind of melt or make that point that sticks out at the transition get real rough. So you just have to be kind of careful with it. So reapplying a little more material here, and just back to the process. Obviously this is not intended to be a buffing education guide, but you always want to work that piece below the center line and, you know, make sure you've got 2 hands on it at all time and wear safety glasses and all that kind of good stuff. So, but this little buffing machine has really worked out great for me. I really like it. It works, you know, for obviously not just shaving brushes, but other small stuff that I want to buff, jewelry or whatever else I can find that needs buffing around the house. So I mentioned earlier that I usually just use this one cut of compound. I do, that other wheel that's on the right there does have charged compound on it. It's a finer kind of a finishing Meguiar's. I think it's like a 5 on the level of how aggressive the cut is. It's more of a fine cut. And I do keep that on there. One thing I read about buffing years ago is that, you know, you do a lot of kind of against the grain or against the profile buffing as you're working it along, and you should always do a kind of on the face, which I'll show here in a minute. You can see how nice that shine looks just from that one compound. So here's what I meant. So going kind of with or against the different directions of buffing that I have done, and you know, I do this at the end just to kind of give it a nice finished profile. So here we are on the final assembly. So we'll just get the coin glued in, and this isn't actually the knot that the customer's using, but it's a similar one. So I've just got some super glue, and because of the static that builds up, you can see that glue immediately wants to work its way over onto the edge, which I don't want it to do. So I'm going to grab a Q-tip here to soak some of that up so that it doesn't push glue up onto the surface of the coin when I put it in. This does happen. I always forget that it happens. I'm pretty sure the static electricity is what causes that to happen. It just wants to, it's kind of like a capillary type action, but simple process, just a little bit of glue, a little dab of glue. I probably put too much in there initially, but secures the coin in there. That's, again, the Harbor Freight CA glue. I just buy those little pouches. I've got, again, a whole bin full of CA glue sitting in the shop, but that's basically the process. I also, because I drilled this hole intentionally deep to make sure there was enough depth, you can see those little coins that are, those little spacers that are sitting there behind the brush handle. I custom made those on my 3D printer to sit. That's a 3mm one, the other one's 2, and then 1, just to allow for good flexibility for the spacers to make sure that the knot sits at the right height. So those are easy enough to put in there. And I always just use silicone, just 100% silicone to set my knots. I used to use epoxy, but that caused more issues than it was worth. But this is a good approximation of how that brush is going to look when it's all said and done. So the silicone works great to set knots with, and would definitely recommend that to anyone. But you can see how nice that shine looks. And that's that. So that's kind of the process. I didn't do the casting on this one. I'll show that in one of my next videos that I do on brush making. But there you have it, the Rosebud Alumilite custom shave brush. Thanks for watching.